Chapter 31. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lost everything. Now that we're gone, what do you think the royals who stayed in the capital want the most? Lu Zhe didn't answer Lin Suisui's question directly. Instead, he asked her in a low voice. Of course they want to replace you. Lin Suisui replied almost without thinking. This was an answer that anyone knew. Was there a need to ask? But it's not easy to get that position. Just getting rid of me is far from enough. So in order to get that position, they need something else. For example, the support of the ministers, or, more importantly, the hearts of the people. Lu Zhe patiently explained these things to Lin Suisui that she didn't understand previously. And from a certain perspective, appeasing the refugees to go to the north to reclaim the land is very helpful for them to accumulate popular support. That's why they arranged for their trusted aides to participate in this matter. Lin Suisui nodded. Although she didn't know much about such things, she knew that if this matter was done well, it would indeed be a good thing for the country and the people. At the very least, it would allow the victims to have a place to live and not be stranded in an unfamiliar land with no one to rely on. However, when she thought of Du Yuanrua, she couldn't help but frown. But that person just now will probably cause a disaster. With Prince Pei watching, nothing will go wrong. Lu Zhe was very confident in Pei Qian. He took the herbs that Lin Suisui had just dug out and placed them in the basket on her back. He comforted her in a low voice, "You just have to take care of yourself." Lin Suisui nodded and didn't say anything else. Instead, she tried her best to search for herbs and wild vegetables. When Lin Suisui returned to the camp, she realized how ruthless Pei Qian was. Not only did he kill the refugees who came to snatch her things, but he also really set up a rack outside Du Yuanrua's tent and hung those bloody corpses in a row like lanterns. Du Yuanrua was so angry that he almost fainted. However, the bloody scene reminded him of what Pei Qian had done in the capital previously. In the end, he didn't dare to confront him. Everyone knew that lunatics weren't to be trifled with. Although Pei Qian looked gentle and refined now, in reality, not only did Pei Qian's move suppress Du Yuanrua, but it also frightened the new refugees who had just joined. At least in the next few days, there were no more robberies in the camp. With the ox cart, the thing that made Lin Suisui the happiest was that Little White had a place to settle down. During this period of time, under Lin Suisui's meticulous care, the little fellow finally recuperated. It had fattened up and began to have the strength to stand up and walk. Lin Suisui didn't want to attract too much attention, so during this period of time, after arriving at the camp, she secretly brought Little White outside so that it could get some fresh air. Usually, she only let it stay in the ox cart. Although the space was small, it was much better than before when it could only stay in the basket. Little White was quite obedient. It usually only played in the ox cart and didn't have the desire to explore the new world. This saved Lin Suisui a lot of trouble. The journey for the next few days was peaceful. On the fifth day, the weather suddenly changed. In the afternoon, it suddenly rained. Resettlement of so many people was a big problem, so Pei Qian immediately instructed the team to stop, set up camp and rest. They would travel after the rain stopped. Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe found a quiet place and used the tree trunks and carriage shed to build a shelter for the cows from the rain and wind with the tarpaulin they had used to set up the tent. She and Lu Zhe stayed in the ox cart, which was shielded from the wind and rain. It was easy to settle them down, but it would take some effort for Mrs. Luo and the others to settle down. Fortunately, they had been practicing during this period of time. Lu Zhe only went over to give them a simple hand, and Mrs. Luo's tent was set up. The two families weren't far apart every time they settled down. It was also the mutual trust that they had cultivated during this period that brought the two families closer. Seeing that Mrs. Luo had settled down, Lu Zhe turned around and was about to go back when he suddenly bumped into a woman walking over with an umbrella. Lu Zhe reacted quickly and took 2 steps back, but the woman clearly didn't have such a quick reaction speed. With a cry of surprise, she fell into the mud. Benoel, what did you do to my sister? Lu Zhe looked expressionlessly at the little girl who was standing in front of him and criticizing him righteously. He was too lazy to say a word and planned to turn around and leave. However, this little girl was very stubborn. She opened her arms and stood in front of him rudely. She didn't intend to give in at all and demanded an explanation. What's wrong with you? Didn't you see that my sister fell? You actually want to leave just like that? What does your sister falling have to do with me? Lu Zhe looked coldly at the little girl in front of him. If Lin Suisui were here, she would be able to tell that he was already quite impatient. I didn't push her or bump into her. Men and women shouldn't touch each other. Should I stay here and let you guys cling to me? Ah Wan, don't talk nonsense. I just accidentally fell. It has nothing to do with him. Lu Zhe's words were quite ruthless. The little girl was immediately furious. She wanted to scold Lu Zhe again, but the woman who had fallen to the ground had already pushed herself up and stopped her sister's accusation with a disapproving expression. Then, she looked at Lu Zhe apologetically and bowed to him uneasily. I'm sorry. My sister was just worried. Please. Before she could finish speaking, she saw that the person she was talking to had already turned around and left without looking back. It was as if she didn't exist at all. In the rain and fog, Miao Nyang bit her lower lip and looked at Lu Zhe's back indignantly. She didn't believe that she was inferior to that weak and sickly Madame Lu. Mrs. Luo had seen this scene clearly from the side. She couldn't help but come out and stand at the entrance of her tent. She advised the sisters rudely, "Girl, give up. The couple has a good relationship. You're an unmarried girl. Don't be evil. When the time comes, you'll be the one to suffer." Chapter 32. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The innocent Lu Zhe. Sister, don't listen to that old woman. Du Wan'er gritted her teeth and helped Du Miao'er back while cursing Mrs. Luo, who had just come out to speak. How would she know about our difficulties? If we don't think of a way, won't we be sold by our stepmother? Wouldn't that ruin the rest of your life? We've seen it over the past few days. Although this hunter looks a little ordinary in the entire refugee camp, look at his wealth. Moreover, when has he ever gone into the forest beside the camp and returned empty-handed? I can tell at a glance that he's capable. If you can marry him, it's better than marrying that old widower, right? Du Miao'er pursed her lips and didn't say anything. How could she not know that her sister was telling the truth? However, judging from the hunter's attitude just now, he didn't seem to care about her at all. But she couldn't give up. She didn't want to marry that widower, nor did she want to be like the other girls in the camp and sell herself to those military ruffians who didn't treat them as humans at all. Therefore, the most suitable candidate was the hunter. Lin Suisui naturally didn't know about the two sisters' plan, but when she saw Lu Zhe returning with a gloomy expression, she brought him a thick cotton handkerchief to wipe his head. Then, she turned around to help him change into new clothes, but Lu Zhe reached out and stopped her. Don't worry, I'll just roast it by the fire. Lu Zhe threw 2 pieces of dry wood into the bonfire beside the carriage. With the cloth covering them, it formed a relatively private space on their side. Lin Suisui was a little worried when she saw Lu Zhe sitting by the bonfire. She wanted to get out of the carriage, but Lu Zhe stood up quickly and stopped her. It's cold outside. Why go out? Then heat this up and drink a bowl to drive away the cold. Seeing that Lu Zhe didn't let her get off the bed, Lin Suisui didn't force him. She only reached out and handed the jar of ginger soup to Lu Zhe. If this rain continues, the temperature will probably drop even more in the next 2 days. Lu Zhe was not too worried about this. They had prepared everything, so he was not afraid of any more accidents. It was just. Thinking of the scene on the way back, Lu Zhe was filled with deep disgust. There were really many people who thought that they were smart and felt smug about themselves. Lin Suisui knew that Lu Zhe had been stopped yesterday. Mrs. Luo, who came to visit the next day, told her. Although it was still raining outside, Lu Zhe and the men from Mrs. Luo's family still decided to try their luck in the forest at the side. Otherwise, if the rain continued, wouldn't they be trapped here? After the men went out, wouldn't the women who stayed in the camp become a distraction? Lin Suisui's needlework actually was not bad. Previously, the Sun family had sent over clothes, but there were also many pieces of cloth that had not been used. Moreover, they were all made of coarse cotton cloth and fine cotton cloth that were very suitable for them. Therefore, when there was nothing to do during this period of time, Lin Suisui took a piece of fine cotton cloth and cut it to make 2 sets of clothes for Lu Zhe and her. When Mrs. Luo was working, she suppressed her voice and told her everything. When those 2 girls left, they still looked indignant. I'm not worried about your husband's character, but once girls have bad intentions, they might do anything. Besides, I took the opportunity to ask around yesterday. The 2 girls from the Du family are pitiful. Their mother had passed away early, and their father had married another woman. With a stepmother, their father no longer treated them as well. Now that their family was in a bad financial situation, their mother had targeted these 2 girls and wanted to match the oldest one with an old widower. It was said that the old widower had a few taels of silver on hand, but at that age, he could already be Du Miaoer's father. She's really ruthless. Mrs. Luo couldn't help but shake her head. Although she sympathized with the sisters, she didn't agree with their actions. She couldn't snatch someone else's husband just because she was pitiful. How could that work? Thank you for your reminder, but since my husband has already rejected this matter yesterday, I believe they will give up. Lin Suisui was not too surprised that the 2 sisters had their eyes on Lu Zhe. Although Lu Zhe had hidden his true appearance and identity and was only living as a hunter, his excellence couldn't be hidden by these superficial things. She didn't want to cause trouble, but she was not afraid of trouble. It would be fine if the sisters stopped here, but if they still refused to give up and continued to pester Lu Zhe, she could turn a blind eye if they didn't implicate her. After all, the final decision was still Lu Zhe's. If Lu Zhe wanted to keep that girl, there was no reason for her to stop him, right? At most, they would part ways and live their own lives. However, although she said it casually, when Lu Zhe returned, there was something wrong with the way Lin Suisui looked at him. Lu Zhe was sharp and naturally noticed the change in Lin Suisui today. He put the rabbit on the grill and turned to look at Lin Suisui, who was sewing clothes on the shaft. He asked calmly, "What's wrong?" It's nothing. Mrs. Luo came over today and told me about yesterday. Lin Suisui didn't expect Lu Zhe to ask directly. For a moment, she was unable to react, but she didn't hide it and mentioned what Mrs. Luo had told her today. However, Lu Zhe's attitude was something Lin Suisui didn't expect. He frowned slightly and looked at Lin Suisui in confusion. "What is it?" "About the 2 sisters yesterday." Lin Suisui glared at Lu Zhe. Her first impression was that this man was pretending to be confused. She couldn't help but feel a little angry. She threw the clothes in her hand into the sewing basket and said angrily, "You didn't forget so quickly, did you? What do they have to do with me?" Lu Zhe looked at Lin Suisui calmly. "Yesterday, when I came back to help Mrs. Luo, the 2 of them suddenly approached me from the side. If I hadn't dodged quickly, I would have been bumped into. But since I didn't bump into anyone, what does it have to do with me?" Chapter 33. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Concern. How was she supposed to answer that? Lin Suisui blinked and thought for a moment before explaining in detail. For example, what Mrs. Luo had said about the 2 sisters' current situation and what they might have thought of him. "But I'm already married." Lu Zhe's expression was indifferent after hearing Lin Suisui's analysis. He even looked back at Lin Suisui with a hint of reproach. He acted like it was obvious. Lin Suesue's face burned. She snorted with an uneasy expression and found an excuse to turn around and get into the ox cart. She quickly and decisively ended this conversation. Lu Zhe looked at the swaying curtains and was very cooperative. He didn't say anything else about this matter. When the rabbit meat was roasted and he called Lin Suisui out for dinner, there was no longer any awkwardness between the two of them because of what had happened previously. But just because they wanted to turn the page didn't mean the others thought the same. The rain only cleared up after 2 days, but because the road was too muddy, the Higher.UPS finally decided to rest for 2 more days and set off when the weather cleared. Seeing that the weather had turned sunny, Lin Suisui also wanted to go to the nearby forest to see if she could dig some wild vegetables to cook porridge. However, with Lu Zhe's instructions last time, she didn't go out with Mrs. Luo and the others this time. Instead, she followed Lu Zhe into the mountain. Because they were stuck here, Lu Zhe made a few simple traps. This time, he entered the mountain to see if there was anything in the traps. The road up the mountain was slippery. Although Lu Zhe deliberately slowed down, Lin Suisui still almost fell a few times. In the end, Lu Zhe couldn't stand it anymore. He squatted down with his back facing Lin Suisui and whispered, "I'll carry you up the mountain." "This isn't appropriate, right? I can go up the mountain myself." Lin Suisui was not trying to act tough. Although the ground was wet and slippery, she had experience entering the mountain in such an environment, so it only looked a little dangerous. She knew how to protect herself. Moreover, although the person in front of her was in trouble now, according to her understanding, this person would definitely not be an ordinary person in the future. So where did she get the courage to let the crown prince carry her up the mountain? "Are you waiting for me to watch you fall to your death?" Lu Zhe turned around and glanced at Lin Suisui in dissatisfaction. His tone was unprecedentedly stern. "If you continue to dawdle, the prey in the trap might run away." Seeing Lu Zhe like this, Lin Suisui only hesitated for a moment. In the end, she obediently lay on Lu Zhe's sturdy back and let him carry her up the mountain. "Hold on tightly." Lu Zhe suddenly stopped after taking 2 steps. He turned his head unhappily and instructed Lin Suisui, who was lying on his back but was tense and stiff, "If you want to fall, continue to be tense." Lin Suisui's face turned red, but she still listened to Lu Zhe's instructions. Her legs tightened around his waist, and her hands tightened around his neck. She was afraid that he would really get annoyed and throw her down. When Lu Zhe arrived near the trap set up, he put Lin Suisui down and instructed her to look for wild herbs here. He went to the trap set up at the side to check his gains. This way, he wouldn't be far from Lin Suisui. Even if there was an emergency, he could rush over immediately to resolve it. Little White was whining in the basket, but Lin Suisui glanced at the muddy ground and rejected its desire to get on the ground and play. "Little White, the ground is covered in mud. If you come down and roll around, you'll become a mud monkey. It's cold and it's not convenient to bathe you. In a few days, I'll let you out to play for a while after the ground is dry." As Lin Suisui squatted down to dig for herbs and wild vegetables, she discussed with Little White, who was humming unhappily in the basket behind her. After Little White's finished recuperating, it was growing every day. From the looks of it, they wouldn't be able to hide this little fellow before they reached their destination. The vegetation in the forest was dense, and there were even more herbs inside. In just a short while, Lin Suisui had dug up half a basket. At this moment, Lu Zhe also walked over with 2 pheasants. When he saw Lin Suisui, he first brought the prey to her to take a look. Then, he said in a happy tone, "I can use them to make soup for you in the next 2 days. But you don't like soup." This time, when Lu Zhe turned his back to her, Lin Suisui didn't hesitate anymore. She lay on his back and let him carry her to the next destination. After interacting with him for so long, Lin Suisui had some understanding of Lu Zhe's eating habits. He didn't like vegetables, but he liked meat. He was not too interested in soup. Every time, Lin Suisui had to coax him to drink half a bowl of ginger soup to ward off the cold. For at least an hour after he drank it, his expression was still dark. Therefore, most of the chicken soup that she had stewed previously entered her and little white stomachs. Lu Zhe wouldn't touch it. "Isn't your period coming soon?" Lu Zhe asked casually, causing Lin Suisui, who was lying on his back, to tremble and almost lose control and fall off Lu Zhe's back. This kind of thing. Lin Suisui was so embarrassed that she wished she could dig a hole and hide in it. However, Lu Zhe couldn't be blamed for this. It was probably because of her physique that the last time she came, she was in so much pain that she wished she was dead. At that time, in order to make her feel better, Lu Zhe even specifically used the hares he had hunted to exchange for some brown sugar and boiled brown sugar ginger water for her. It was probably because she had suffered too much last time that Lu Zhe remembered this matter clearly. "I asked Mrs. Luo before. Mrs. Luo said that if there's no brown sugar ginger water, it's the same to make chicken soup." Lu Zhe didn't think too much about it. He just wanted to make Lin Suisui feel better. If he had not encountered this accident and was still in the East Palace, he only needed to arrange for the imperial physician to take his pulse and nurse his body. What kind of rare herbs couldn't he get? But now, there was a limit to what he could do. Lu Zhe was carrying Lin Suisui on his back. At this moment, he was actually blaming himself. Actually, most young girls like her were still wheedling around their fathers and brothers. If not for him, how could she have suffered so much? Lu Zhe was distracted by these thoughts when he felt the little girl's body on his back stiffen. Just as she leaned towards his ear to remind him that someone was there, he had already quickly brought Lin Suisui into a bush at the side. Chapter 34. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Don't move. As Lu Zhe hid in the bushes with Lin Suisui, two people came out from behind the forest not far away. At a glance, even Lin Suisui could tell that they were not wearing the clothes of their kingdom's people. These were two northern barbarians. But this place was still quite a distance from the northern border. Why were these two northern barbarians here? Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe looked at each other. Neither of them said anything. They tacitly turned their heads to continue checking the movements of the two northern barbarians in the distance. However, the two barbarians seemed to be waiting for someone. When they were about 10 steps away from them, they stopped and stood in the forest while communicating in a barbarian language. Lin Suisui didn't understand their language, but it was obvious that Lu Zhe, who was beside her, could understand it. Therefore, Lin Suisui could feel the murderous aura that Lu Zhe suddenly emitted. Worried, she reached out and grabbed Lu Zhe's wrist. She signaled him to calm down for the time being. As if they had agreed on it, not long after the two northern barbarians arrived, there was another commotion not far away. The two people who came this time were very familiar to Lin Suisui and Lu Zhe. These two people had been by Du Yuanruo's side when he came out to confront Pei Qian. But now, these two people had appeared in the forest and even interacted with these two northern barbarians. These two groups of people didn't interact for long. They also communicated in the barbarian language. Then, they saw the two Du Yuanruo subordinates take out something and give it to the two barbarians. After that, they turned around and quickly left. After the two groups of people had disappeared and there was no other movement, wanting to understand what was going on, Lin Suisui turned to look at Lu Zhe. Du Yuanruo colluded with the northern barbarians to secretly kidnap us refugees and sell us as slaves. This way, since Du Yuanruo can push all the blame to the fourth prince's family, as the person in charge, Pei Qian will naturally be blamed and then be accused of colluding with external enemies. This way, not only will the Ningyuan Marquis be wiped out, but even the fourth prince's family will be wiped out. In addition, if this batch of refugees were successfully bought out, they would also obtain a considerable amount of wealth. Du Yuanruo can kill two birds with one stone. How ruthless! As Lu Zhe spoke, he reached out to help Lin Suisui stand up from the ground. Then, just like before, he carried Lin Suisui and walked down the mountain while explaining the situation to her. Then, what should we do now? Lin Suisui frowned. Since Du Yuanrua had schemed against them, he was guilty of a heinous crime. If they didn't think of a way to stop him, the innocent refugees would be the ones to suffer. However, they couldn't tell Pei Qian the news directly. After all, she and Lu Zhe were just two ordinary villagers. How could they understand the northern barbarian language? We can find a chance to tell Pei Qian. There's no need to make it so clear. We just need to tell him that we saw Du Yuanrua's people colluding with the northern barbarians. We don't have to worry about anything else. It would be even harder to walk down the mountain on such a slippery road. However, Lu Zhe walked very steadily, so that Lin Suisui, who was on his back, didn't feel any danger or discomfort. Compared to just now, Lin Suisui, who was on Lu Zhe's back again, was clearly much more relaxed than before. She even swayed her calf, which was hanging from Lu Zhe's waist, in satisfaction. It brushed past the man's lean and muscular waist like a fish playfully crossing the lotus. Lu Zhe's heart fluttered. His voice was husky as he said, "Don't move." Lin Suisui was stunned for a moment before realizing what he was referring to. She quickly stopped shaking her calf and blushed as she subconsciously buried her head in Lu Zhe's back. No sooner had the two of them returned to camp when the rain, which had stopped for most of the day, began to patter down again. In fact, it seemed to be getting heavier by the evening. The sudden drop in temperature made people feel the chill brought about by the climate in the northern region for the first time. Ednel.co Lin Suisui originally planned to accompany Lu Zhe to pack up the prey he had just hunted today, but Lu Zhe rejected Lin Suisui's suggestion very bluntly. "It's cold outside. Just stay in the car. I'll be back soon after I finish packing." Lu Zhe insisted, so Lin Suisui didn't insist. She returned to the carriage and took out the thick clothes she had prepared so that Lu Zhe could change into them when he returned later. As tidying up, she suddenly heard a commotion outside. Lin Suisui didn't pay much attention at first, but unexpectedly, the commotion became louder and louder. She actually felt that they were getting closer and closer to her. Her instincts told her that something was wrong. She leaned against the car and lifted the curtains to look out. She saw a group of people surrounding Mrs. Luo's tent and talking excitedly. Seeing that the other party was about to attack, Mrs. Luo's family came out quickly. It was unknown what Mrs. Luo and the others said, but although those people were still a little indignant, they still reluctantly dispersed. Fortunately, Lin Suisui didn't think too much about this matter. Mrs. Luo asked her third daughter, Fang Ruier, to bring them dumplings. "It's all because of the Du family. Didn't mother bring us up the mountain to look for wild vegetables today? Coincidentally, we bumped into the Du family. You didn't see it, but those people from the Du family were very fierce. My mother also pitied the two sisters from the Du family and couldn't stand it anymore, so she helped persuade them. In the end, there was a commotion. They were fierce, but we aren't to be trifled with either. Besides, the Du family's stepmother was unreasonable to begin with, so she was scolded away in the end. She was the one who gathered a group of people to cause trouble for my mother." At this point, Fang Ruier became even angrier. Without waiting for Lin Suisui to speak, she continued to complain unhappily, "My mother stood up for the sisters, but when it was time for the sisters to come out and explain what happened during the day, the sisters were unwilling to say a word. Fortunately, there were others around during the day who could testify for us. Otherwise, we really wouldn't have been able to explain things clearly this time and could only take the blame for bullying them. Just thinking about it makes me angry. This is similar to what my husband told me yesterday. My husband said that fortunately, he dodged quickly yesterday. Otherwise, he would have been pestered and unable to escape." After hearing Fang Ruier's resentful complaint, Lin Suisui naturally thought of Lu Zhe's attitude when he mentioned this yesterday. Chapter 35. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It's easier to invite a god than to send it away. Fong Ruier sat for a while and was about to rush back when Lin Suisui came out to see her off. The two of them had just walked out of the oilcloth wind curtain while chatting and laughing when they saw the sisters, who had been mentioned by the two of them earlier, kneeling outside Mrs. Luo's tent not far away. They were sobbing and seemed to be explaining something. It would have been better if she hadn't looked. When Fong Ruier saw them, her expression darkened. "You're still unwilling to give up." Fong Ruier held the umbrella and rushed back to her tent aggressively. Lin Suisui wanted to stand and watch. If anything was wrong, she could go over and support Mrs. Luo and the others. However, Mrs. Luo's reaction was not slow. Soon, she came out with her eldest daughter in law and helped the sisters up before inviting them into the tent. It wasn't appropriate to watch any longer. Coincidentally, Lu Zhe had also finished packing up the pheasants and hares. Seeing Lin Suisui standing in the wind, he said disapprovingly, "Why are you standing here? Ruier just sent the dumplings over." Lin Suisui helped Lu Zhe take off the bamboo hat on his head and told him what had happened in a soft voice. Then, she continued worriedly, "I wanted to go over and take a look, but from the looks of it, Mrs. Luo and the others should have found a solution." Lu Zhe nodded. He was not very interested in this kind of thing. He hung the prey on a branch at the side to drain it. As he turned around, he walked back to the bonfire and said to her, "Just do as you see fit. However, it's best if you ignore those two sisters." "I know. Those two don't have any good intentions." Lin Suisui agreed with Lu Zhe's suggestion. Although she was not interested in such schemes, she was not stupid. It was a fact that they were usually close to Mrs. Luo's family. All the refugees nearby who were familiar with them knew that she and Lu Zhe were the only ones in their family. It was not appropriate for the girls to approach them. If they could get the help of Mrs. Luo's family and use them to get closer to them, it would indeed be a good idea. However, Lin Suisui also knew that the final responsibility was on Lu Zhe. However, Lin Suisui didn't say anything. After all, none of this had happened yet. What she was thinking was just her guess. Everything depended on how it developed. But it was definitely wise to be careful. Because Mrs. Luo had sent dumplings over, the two of them decided to have a simple meal and rest at night. As soon as they finished eating, Fong Ruier rushed back to the house. "It's those two sisters. Didn't they get drenched in the rain just now? If they go back like this, my mother is worried that they might catch a cold and fall sick. She asked me to come over and get some herbs to cook and drink in order to ward off the cold for them." Although Fong Ruier was still dissatisfied with the sisters, her attitude was clearly not as harsh as before. It seemed that the sisters had gained something at Mrs. Luo's house just now. Lin Suisui nodded and got up to go to the carriage to get some of the herbs that had been dried and put away. She also took 2 large pieces of ginger and handed them to Fong Ruier. "These herbs are the best for repelling cold. Take them back and boil them with this ginger. The effect will be even better." Fong Ruier thanked her and hurriedly turned to leave again. It had to be said that Mrs. Luo's worry was reasonable. The next day, there was indeed news that Du Miaoer was sick and had a fever. Du Miaoer was extremely anxious and ran over early in the morning to ask Mrs. Luo for help. Before Mrs. Luo could react, the Du family's stepmother had already brought a group of familiar old women to look for Du Miaoer. After a commotion, the Du family left Du Miaoer at Mrs. Luo's tent. Du Miaoer was left sitting on the ground, crying in Du Wan'er arms. Although Mrs. Luo was also filled with grievance and anger, the unreasonable one was the Du family's stepmother. Looking at the 2 poor little girls on the ground, she really couldn't make the decision to ignore them completely. Therefore, in the end, she helped Du Wan'er help her sister into the tent. Lin Suisui, who had watched everything from the beginning to the end, subconsciously thought of a saying, "It was easy to invite a god, but difficult to send a god away." Since the older sister of the Du family was sick, she naturally had to see a doctor. However, in this environment, it was difficult to even fill one's stomach, let alone find a doctor in this remote place. This was also the reason the Du family's stepmother abandoned her to Mrs. Luo. Lin Suisui naturally thought of Mrs. Luo's anxiety. When she saw Feng Ruier coming out of the tent with her head lowered, she raised her hand and gestured for her to come over and talk. Feng Ruier had always trusted Lin Suisui, so she didn't think too much about it and ran over to her in the rain. "How's the Du family's sister?" As Lin Suisui poured a bowl of ginger soup for her, she asked about the progress of the matter in a low voice. At the mention of this, Feng Ruier's expression turned ugly. "It's bad. The fever won't subside. My mother is worried. That girl said that they have an old doctor who knows some medical skills, but what about the consultation fee? Besides, I feel that something is wrong. Don't be anxious. I'll accompany you to take a look." When Lin Suisui heard Feng Ruier say this, she more or less had a guess. She got up and climbed into the ox cart. She took out her needle bag and stuffed it into her arms. Then, she changed her shoes and looked at Feng Ruier. "Don't look at me like that. It's just a coincidence that I have some medical skills. I can't guarantee that I can any serious disease, but a headache and fever won't stump me." Feng Ruier's eyes lit up when she heard Lin Suisui's words. She couldn't be bothered to ask anymore. She nodded and pulled Lin Suisui in the direction of their tent. When she reached the door, before she could enter, she heard a crisp voice crying and begging, "Auntie, I beg you. I know I'm asking too much, but we're really at our wits' end now. Please help my sister get that doctor to take a look first. Just treat it as if my sister and I borrowed the treatment fee from you first. When my sister recovers, we will definitely think of a way to earn money to pay you back. Look, my sister has already been feverish for a day and a night. If this continues, I'm afraid she won't be able to hold on anymore." Chapter 36. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lin Suisui's carefulness. "Mother, I've found a doctor for her. Lu Nyang said that she knows medicine and can help her treat her illness." Feng Ruier naturally heard everything that was said inside. She was afraid that her mother would be soft-hearted, so she nodded and dragged Lin Suisui in. "Why are you still so careless?" Mrs. Luo was shocked by Feng Ruier's sudden appearance, especially when she saw Lin Suisui, who had been pulled in by her. Mrs. Luo naturally had her own guesses. However, everyone knew that if they couldn't get evidence now, everything could only be speculation. Therefore, Mrs. Luo had originally planned to spend some money to resolve the problem and send the sisters away first. However, she didn't expect her daughter to appear at this critical moment and ruin things. Treatment is not a joke. Don't bully Lu Nyang. Hurry up and send her back to rest. Mrs. Luo subconsciously wanted to quickly disassociate Lin Suisui from this matter. She kept winking at Feng Ruier, who was at the front. Seeing this, Lin Suisui could actually easily guess her good intentions. She didn't give Mrs. Luo any time to make things difficult for Feng Ruier. She already smiled and said, "Mrs. Luo, I wanted to come over myself. L.rg. I heard from Ruier that this girl has had a high fever for more than a day. If she doesn't think of a way to get rid of this fever, she'll be in danger. I happen to know a little about medicine, so I thought of coming over to take a look at her." Seeing how confident Lin Suisui was, although Mrs. Luo was still a little hesitant, she didn't stop her in the end. Just as she was about to stand up and make way for her, Du Wanner, who had been crying and saying that no one was willing to treat her sister, actually got up from the ground and opened her arms to block Lin Suisui. "No, I disagree." Her eyes flickered. Although she was trying her best to maintain her composure, her trembling voice still revealed her panic and uneasiness. "You're just an ordinary woman. How can you treat someone? My sister is seriously ill now. If you treat her but harm her in the end, what will happen? Since I promised to come over to take a look, I'm naturally confident. Your sister's fever hasn't subsided yet. I'm afraid simple medicine won't work. Lin Suisui glanced at Du Miaoer, who was lying in bed with her cheeks burning. She said calmly and confidently, if you really want to save your sister, move aside now. Du Wanner wanted to struggle and stop her again, but Feng Ruier, who was a few steps away, pulled her away. Although Feng Ruier didn't know the details, she knew that saving people was more important now. She didn't want to hear her chatter anymore. Seeing that the way had been cleared, Lin Suisui didn't say anything else to Du Wanner. She walked over and first took Du Miaoer's pulse before taking out a needle bag. As she skillfully applied the needle to a few acupuncture points, she said to reassure Mrs. Luo, don't worry, it's not a big deal. I'll apply the needle to her acupuncture points first and ask Ruier to follow me back later. I'll prepare the medicine and boil it for her. 3 bowls of water will be boiled 3 times a day. She'll be fine after drinking it for 2 days. I didn't expect you to really know medicine. Mrs. Luo was originally very worried, but when she saw Lin Suisui's skillfulness, she finally relaxed. She smiled and praised, in the future, if anyone has a headache or fever, I'll rely on you. Lin Suisui waited for a while before putting away the silver needles and asking Feng Ruier to follow her to get the medicine. From the beginning to the end, she didn't say another word to Du Wanner. It was as if she, the patient's relative, didn't exist at all. Are you sure my sister will be fine? Lin Suisui didn't want to talk to her anymore, but that didn't mean that Du Wanner would give up. Seeing that Lin Suisui was about to leave, she finally couldn't help but rush out and shout at her back, if my sister's condition worsens, how are you going to take responsibility? Du Wanner, as a doctor, I have a word of loyalty to give to you sisters. No matter what happens, your body is yours. If you don't cherish it and treat your body as a joke, even if the medicine god descends, he won't be able to save your sister at all. Lin Suisui stopped and turned to look at Du Wanner with a smile. She didn't stand on ceremony with her at all. After lecturing Du Wanner, Lin Suisui turned around and left quickly. Feng Ruier was confused, but when she saw Lin Suisui leave, she didn't think too much about it. She turned around and ran after Lin Suisui. Lu Niang, what do you mean by that? Feng Ruier followed Lin Suisui back to her and Lu Zai's ox cart. She surrounded Lin Suisui, who was collecting herbs, and kept asking questions. Do you mean that Du Miaoer's illness is fake? She's not pretending. I just took her pulse. Her body is indeed very weak. Lin Suisui shook her head, but thinking of the Du family's actions today, she hesitated for a moment before saying her guess. I just think that the Du family's stepmother might be thinking of using this matter to extort money. Could it be that there's something wrong with the doctor they're talking about? Although Feng Ruier reacted slowly, she was not stupid. After Lin Suisui's reminder, she immediately understood the main point of this entire matter. That's right. We only confirmed that you know medicine after you went over to take Du Miaoer's pulse. But we've never seen the doctor that Du Wanner highly recommended just now. If, by any chance, he was hired by the Du family's stepmother to mess around, wouldn't the money we paid be for nothing? Besides, he can also say that we're on the way to the north now, so the conditions are tough, and the herbs he has are limited. In order to treat Du Miaoer's illness, he has to spend more money. Lin Suisui wrapped up the medicine she had prepared and raised her hand to hand it to Feng Ruier. Then, she said very seriously, actually, I also hope that this speculation is just me being petty. But it didn't hurt to be careful. Go back and tell your mother that from today onwards until Du Miaoer recovers from her illness, no matter how the Du family causes trouble, no matter how Du Wanner stirs up trouble, no one can touch what she eats. Whether it was medicine or food, it was all the same. If the Du family's stepmother is unwilling, just say that as long as Du Miaoer leaves your tent and receives treatment from others, and if any illness worsens, it will have nothing to do with your family. Chapter 37 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Harvest. After sending Fong Royer off, Lin Suisui turned around and began to make soup. It had been raining for the past few days, and the humidity was too high. When she was looking for herbs just now, she had also found some herbs to prevent dampness. Today, when she was making chicken soup, she could stew them together. Lu Zhe woke up early and went up the mountain with a few men from Mrs. Luo's family. According to the Fong family's eldest son, they had found traces of wild boars in the valley yesterday. However, in terms of hunting, they could only be considered half-baked. Therefore, they wanted Lu Zhe to go up the mountain. If Lu Zhe was lucky enough to catch a wild boar, their meals for the next 2 days would be greatly improved. Lin Suisui placed the clay pot on the bonfire. While she guarded the soup, she took out her sewing basket and started sewing. Anyway, they had done what they had to do and explained everything. As for how things would develop in the future, they could only take it one step at a time. Just as Lin Suisui had told Fong Royer, the Du family quickly went to Mrs. Luo's house. However, with Lin Suisui's instructions this time, Mrs. Luo, who had already suffered previously, was also prepared this time. She had long informed the women from the surrounding families. Now that the Du family had arrived, Mrs. Luo stood at the entrance of the tent and shouted at the sister's stepmother. "Invite a doctor. Back then, you threw your stepdaughter into the mud at my door and left without looking back. Where did you go back then? After I took out the money and hired a doctor to prescribe medicine, your stepdaughter's fever has subsided. Who would believe that you were worried about her and hired a doctor to treat her? In short, let me say this first. I won't stop you, but if she leaves now, what she eats or drinks, and if her condition worsens in the future, it won't be my problem." As soon as Mrs. Luo said this, the Du family's stepmother, Du Wangshi, immediately lost her temper. She placed one hand on her waist and lit Mrs. Luo up with the other. She spat. "Pfft! Why are you so unreasonable? Just because you said you hired a doctor, it's true. Who know if you didn't just casually grab someone from the roadside? Originally, I could be more at ease with one keeping an eye. But now, you even chased one home. What are you thinking? If anything happens to my daughter, can you afford to pay? You don't have to worry about that. Everyone is watching. Anyway, your girl is in my tent now. My family is watching over her. If anything happens, my family will naturally be responsible for it. It's better for your people to leave. Anyway, when your girl recovers, I'll naturally hand her over to you in front of everyone. As for now, it's better to stay away from the sisters. I'm afraid of being scammed. Now, I can't even escape them. Do you want to falsely accuse my family?" Mrs. Luo spat. In the face of the Du family's stepmother's coercion, she didn't give in at all. She had now realized that the Du family was full of schemers. Now that they were already entangled, if they weren't careful, their entire family would probably be screwed. This time, Mrs. Luo had help. Although the Du family's stepmother had been pestering her for most of the day, Mrs. Luo was still reasonable and imposing. In the end, the Du family's stepmother didn't gain any advantage and could only leave dejectedly. After temporarily resolving such a big problem, both Mrs. Luo and Lin Suisui felt much more relaxed. Perhaps it was because they were in a good mood that they were quite lucky today. When Lu Zhe and the others returned from the mountain, they actually carried back a fat wild boar. There were about 20 men who went up the mountain together this time. Including the families who usually had a good relationship with them, almost more than 10 families could share it. For a moment, the families in this area of the camp were all overjoyed, especially the children. They chased after the adults happily and shouted that they wanted to eat meat. Lu Zhe and Lin Suisui were the only ones in their family, so Lu Zhe didn't ask for too much. After discussing with Lin Suisui, he only asked for half a fan of pork ribs and a large piece of lard. The pork ribs were what Lu Zhe planned to bring back to roast for Lin Suisui. As for the lard, Lin Suisui suggested it. Compared to meat, the oil could be stored in a clay pot for a long time. If they encountered a lack of food like before, this thing could save lives. The gains and joy on this side naturally attracted the envy and jealousy of the other refugees beside them. However, these people were already experienced. The moment the wild boar was transported back and slaughtered, they cut off the best portion and sent it to Pei Qian's tent. With this relationship, no matter how considerate the refugees were, no one really had the guts to snatch it from them. As for the generals and soldiers patrolling nearby, they didn't lack food and drink in the first place. Now that they had killed the wild boar, at most, they would be invited to enjoy it together. Both sides benefited. Mrs. Luo and the others were happy, but the Du family was in a completely different state. The Du family's stepmother, Du Wangshe, was holding a rattan in her hand and chasing after Du Wan'er with great force. Although Du Wan'er ran quickly, she still inevitably suffered a few heavy blows. Tears flowed down her face from the pain. "Little bitch, you're such a loser. You and your sister are useless. What can you do? No matter how petty that old woman is, she can still squeeze out some money, right? You guys are useless. Let me tell you, when your sister comes back this time, get married quickly. It's a waste of money for you two useless people to stay at home." She was panting from the chase. In the end, she sat down on a stool at the side but still didn't stop cursing. Originally, Du Wan'er didn't intend to respond, but when she heard that her stepmother wanted to sell her sister in advance, she couldn't help but beg, "Mother, don't be angry. My sister and I are useless, but there's really a reason this time." "Reason? What reason? Are you afraid that I won't be able to tell what her scheme is? She doesn't like the person I chose, but why doesn't she take a closer look at her unpresentable appearance? She's already lucky that a widower is willing to spend 5 taels of silver to marry her. What else does she want? Does she want to marry the emperor?" Chapter 38. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Pride. "Mother, I know that you want my sister to marry that widower because you want her to settle down in the northern region in the future. With Brother in Law's ability as a butcher, he can make our lives easier." Du Wan'er was flustered, but she still said what Du Miaoer had told her previously, "But that widower already has 2 children at home. Moreover, he has 2 younger brothers and a mean old mother. Even if my sister marries over, how many people can help our family?" Du Wan'er spoke very quickly. When she heard this, the mean expression on her face hadn't disappeared, but her tone had clearly softened. "Then what does your sister mean? She wants to marry into the Fong family." Although the Fong family still had a son who wasn't married yet, weren't there a bunch of people in their family? Besides, old Madame Luo looks kind, but she's not easy to fool. How much profit can our family get from your sister marrying him? Although she was greedy and mean, she wasn't stupid. After weighing the pros and cons, she naturally knew which side was more beneficial to her. The Fong family seemed good, but only for Du Miaoer. To her, it might not be. It's not the Fong family. It's that hunter, Gu Erlang. Du Wan'er gritted her teeth and told Du Wangshe her sister's plan in a low voice. "I've asked my sister. There's no one else in his family now, and there's no family on this trip. He only a wife beside him, and that wife doesn't look strong. I haven't seen her do any heavy work." Gu Erlang was a capable man. It was said that whenever he entered the mountains, he would never return empty-handed. It was said that Gu Erlang had brought those people to hunt this wild boar today. If my sister married over and Gu Erlang had no other relatives to rely on, wouldn't our family be his only family? With the help of ASON.IN Law like Gu Erlang, my junior and the others might be able to study in a private school. When they become successful in the future, will you still have to be afraid that you won't have wealth to enjoy? Du Wangshe was stunned. She really didn't expect her 2 stepdaughters to have such intentions. However, on second thought, Gu Erlang would really be much better than the widower. At least, without parents or family, he would be much better off. At the very least, since he had the ability to hunt, they wouldn't have to worry about food or drink at home in the future. But isn't Gu Erlang's wife still fine? When Du Wangshe thought of that thick and spacious ox cart, the greed in her heart couldn't help but surge. It was a good idea to let that wretched girl test the waters first. If Gu Erlang's family was really rich, since Linger wasn't young, Linger was definitely a good candidate for marriage. Isn't it still a long way from the camp? Du Wanner lowered her head, gritted her teeth, and said in a soft voice. Although their plan was indeed a little unkind, every man for himself. The sisters had no way out. Anyway, at most, when her sister married him, she would set up a memorial tablet for her. Then I'll be frank. You can't ruin our family's reputation. If you affect Linger in the end, I'll tear you two apart one by one. Du Wangshe raised her eyebrows slightly and sized up Du Wanner before warning slowly, tell your sister that if she has the ability to succeed, it's fine, but if there's still no news before we reach the camp, then marry that horse butcher obediently. Understand? Du Wanner nodded repeatedly and heaved a sigh of relief. She quickly stood up and was about to tell Du Miao the good news. Lin Suisui naturally didn't know that she and Lu Zhe had already become targets. She was in the ox cart checking Lu Zhe's condition. Because of the effect of the pills that she had previously prepared, although the remaining poison in Lu Zhe's body hadn't been completely eliminated, at least it had a small impact on his body now. During this period of time, Lin Suisui had relied on silver needles to clear the poison for him. After persistent usage, it was quite effective. Looking at the bowl of thick black poisonous blood that was suffused with a stench forced out of Lu Zhe's fingertips, Lin Suisui didn't look relaxed at all. We can only suppress it for the time being. If we want to completely eradicate it, we have to wait until we reach the base before we can think about it. The poison in Lu Zhe's body was very complicated. Now that resources were limited, she couldn't completely understand the contents. She could only try her best to reduce the adverse effects of this medicine on Lu Zhe's body. It's fine. Lu Zhe was already used to it. He sat up and dressed before asking about her visit to Mrs. Luo's house to treat the Du sisters. It's easy to dodge a spear in the open, but difficult to guard against an arrow in the dark. I think it's not a good idea to hide like this. I might as well probe the situation and figure out what they want to do. Lin Suisui also had her own considerations about this matter. If they were really desperate and only wanted Mrs. Luo to help, then I would have done my part as a doctor by saving them. But if they really had ulterior motives, I shouldn't have let them successfully harm Mrs. Luo and the others. Lu Zhe nodded and didn't object to Lin Suisui's actions. He only reminded her to be careful. After 3 consecutive days of cloudy weather, the weather finally cleared up. Du Miao, who had been living in the Luo family's tent, finally recovered when everyone set off again. Du Miao was naturally grateful for Mrs. Luo's help. If not for Mrs. Luo stopping her stepmother, she would have knelt down and kowtowed to her. However, Mrs. Luo didn't intend to continue her relationship with this pair of sisters. She only wanted to quickly send them away so that she could have some peace. Du Miao wasn't in a hurry to leave. Instead, she continued to stand in front of Mrs. Luo and asked in a low voice, "Aunt, how much did you pay for the doctor? I can't let you spend money." Mrs. Luo was stunned. The person who was treating Du Miao was Lin Suisui. She had yet to ask about the consultation fee. However, Mrs. Luo also knew that these sisters weren't to be trifled with. Thinking of her previous suspicion, she subconsciously didn't want to implicate Lin Suisui and the others in this matter, so she said very generously, "It's just a few bags of herbs. How much can it be worth? It's not a big deal. Your health is important, so don't worry about it. Go back and rest." Chapter 39. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Crisis. Du Miao was definitely unwilling to go back like this. Of course, she knew who was treating her and why Mrs. Luo was pushing her away. Even though she had been patient these past few days, this old woman still didn't trust her completely. Was she afraid that she would have a chance to get involved with the Gu family? But now, this opportunity was given to her by that woman. How could she let it go so easily? Upon receiving her sister's gaze, Du Wan'er quickly interrupted, "Sister, the person who treated you is Lun Yang. Why don't we go over and ask her about the consultation fee? We can also thank her." As if she had thought of something, she continued in embarrassment, "Speaking of which, I should apologize to Lun Yang. Previously, she said that she wanted to come over and treat you. At that time, I was very suspicious of her, so I was very disrespectful." The sisters cooperated well and immediately stopped Mrs. Luo from stopping them. After all, no matter what, Lin Suisui was their savior. It was only right for them to thank her. After knowing that the sisters had come personally, Lin Suisui wasn't too surprised. She calmly put down her half-finished clothes and stood up to receive the two guests who were accompanied by Mrs. Luo. "You're too polite. I only know a little about medicine. Besides, you were not suffering from any major illness. It was just a small cold. However, your body is weak. You have to be more careful in the future." After understanding their purpose, Lin Suisui only smiled and spoke politely to the sisters. This was the first time Du Miao'er had come into contact with Lin Suisui so closely. Previously, she had heard Du Wan'er say what she had said at Mrs. Luo's house. She was originally worried that the young lady in front of her had seen through her plan, so she came this time with the intention of being mocked and humiliated by this young lady. However, to her surprise, the young lady in front of her was very calm. She didn't seem to be dissatisfied with her or look down on her at all. It was as if she was facing an ordinary visitor. She was polite and distant. "Thank you for your reminder. Other than thanking you, I also want to ask you about the consultation fee. Mrs. Luo helped us, so we shouldn't let her pay for it." Du Miao'er's voice sounded gentle, the type that many men liked. However, Lin Suisui wasn't a man. Therefore, she only looked at Du Miao'er and smiled gently. She pushed this matter away. "You're welcome. You're not seriously ill to begin with. You just caught a cold. The medicine I gave you is also easy to find on the mountain. It's not a big deal. Besides, we've been together for so many days. It's really unreasonable to ask for money for such a small matter." Du Miao'er knew that Lin Suisui wasn't as easy to deal with as she had expected. Therefore, she didn't stay and embarrass herself. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, she stood up and bade farewell. After sending the sisters off, Mrs. Luo heaved a sigh of relief. "We finally sent them off. I had been on tenterhooks these past few days, afraid that something would go wrong and make her condition worse. Now, we can finally send them back." After spending the past few days together, Mrs. Luo actually sympathized with Du Miao'er and her sister. However, sympathy wasn't a reason for them to do evil. There were many pitiful people in this world, but not all of them went down on the wrong path. But speaking of which, there have been a lot of people coughing recently. After Mrs. Luo finished speaking, she suddenly thought of something and said to Lin Suisui in a low voice, "This morning, a few acquaintances of mine came to talk to me. They mentioned that among the refugees who just came in, not only were some coughing and having fevers, but there were also red spots on their bodies. Some of them were seriously festered. It was scary." "What did you say?" At first, Lin Suisui didn't pay much attention to it, but when Mrs. Luo mentioned the symptoms of the patients, her expression immediately changed. "You're saying that those people have red spots?" "Yes, that's what the people I know said." Although Mrs. Luo didn't know why Lin Suisui was so agitated, she nodded with certainty and told her what she knew in detail. "You didn't come into contact with those people, right?" Lin Suisui's face was a little pale. Without much hesitation, she looked at Mrs. Luo and asked seriously. Envy no. The weather was good today. None of them went into the tent. We were just outside in the sun and chatting. What's wrong? Mrs. Luo couldn't help but become nervous when she saw Lin Suisui like this. She looked at Lin Suisui worriedly. I can't be sure, but it's never wrong to be careful. Just keep this in mind first. Don't tell anyone for the time being. I'll go over and take a look later. Lin Suisui was a little flustered. She couldn't make a decision without seeing the patient, but it had better not be what she thought it was. If that was the case, I'll go with you and find an excuse. Anyway, it's sunny outside now. Everyone is sunbathing outside. When Mrs. Luo heard Lin Suisui's words, she more or less guessed something. Although she was already extremely afraid, she also understood that if such a thing really happened, they would probably suffer. There was no way to escape. There might be a way to salvage the situation before it completely spread. Lin Suisui nodded and didn't delay. She put down the things in her hand and walked out with Mrs. Luo. However, before she could walk that far towards her destination, she heard a miserable cry from the direction they were going. Mother, wake up. This cry made Lin Suisui, who was halfway there, speed up. Together with the surrounding refugees who only heard the commotion but didn't know the reason, they rushed in the direction of the cry. Chapter 40. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Disposal. At the very least, refugees who were qualified to go on the northern expedition were healthy. Therefore, when they heard that someone had died here, many refugees nearby were very surprised, but most of them didn't take it seriously. Lin Suisui was one of the early arrivals. She stood outside the tent and took a look at the condition of the woman who was no longer breathing. She had some inkling now. She quickly turned around and pulled Mrs. Luo, who had accompanied her, back. As she walked, she whispered to her, "Go back first. Tell Ruyer and the others not to run around. Don't interact with others for the time being. If they come into contact with others, they must wash their hands with hot water." Where are you going? Seeing that Lin Suisui was planning to go elsewhere, Mrs. Luo was a little worried and reached out to pull her back. Don't mess around. I'll go look for Pei Qian. This matter can't be delayed. The longer we delay, the more unimaginable the consequences will be. Lin Suisui made a decisive decision. If they dealt with the plague in the refugee camp as soon as possible, they could still control it. But if they delayed any longer... Mrs. Luo wanted to stop her, but before she could persuade her, Lin Suisui had already walked away. She felt conflicted for a moment. After thinking for a long time, she suddenly thought that she should go back and find Lu Zhe. Pei Qian had been in a bad mood for the past 2 days. He hated rainy days the most, but it had been raining for so many days. At this moment, he was sitting behind the table and checking the various letters that had been sent up. He heard a commotion outside, especially the voice of Du Yuanrua, who he hated. Qian He. Lu Zhe frowned and called out in an interrogative and warning tone. After hearing his master's instructions, Qian He didn't dare to delay and quickly walked out of the tent. Not long after, he turned around and walked in. He said to Lu Zhe, who was behind the table, with a strange expression, "Prince, it's Madame Lu. At this moment, we happen to meet Third Young Master Du, who was looking for you." Third Young Master Du is... Before Qian He could finish speaking, he saw that the man who had been sitting behind the table had already walked around him and gone out. He didn't say anything else and quickly followed Pei Qian out. Lin Suisui felt that she should really flip through the almanac when she went out to do things in the future. Otherwise, why would she be pestered by such a slug at such a critical moment? How disgusting. If you have any difficulties, it's the same if you look for me. Du Yuanrua was originally a playboy. Because he had met up with Pei Qian these few days, he had no choice but to restrain himself. Now that he happened to see a young lady taking the initiative to look for Pei Qian, his competitive desire was triggered. Although Lin Suisui looked like a delicate little girl, since she had something to do with Pei Qian, he had to fight for her. I'm afraid you can't make the decision on this matter. Lin Suisui calmly took a few steps back and dodged Du Yuanruo. She smiled politely. She didn't want to waste her breath on the person in front of her. As expected, before Du Yuanruo could continue acting cocky, he saw Pei Qian walking out of the tent. Are you planning to let me invite you back personally? Pei Qian narrowed his eyes slightly. The sunlight above his head made him feel a little uncomfortable. The various discomforts made Pei Qian feel like he would lash out at any moment. Naturally, his tone was definitely not very gentle. Du Yuanruo was undoubtedly afraid of Pei Qian. However, even if he was afraid, it still couldn't stop Du Yuanruo from going against him all the time. He raised his chin in a bluff and stared at Pei Qian as he snorted fearlessly. Didn't this woman say that she had something to report to you? In the refugee camp, you don't have the final say now. Since it's serious business, I naturally have the right to come over and listen. Sirs, I suspect that there's a plague in the refugee camp. Lin Suisui didn't have the time to participate in the fight between the two of them and directly explained the purpose of her trip. She was very straightforward and didn't hide anything. What did you say? Before Pei Qian could respond, Du Yuanruo jumped up like a cat whose tail had been stepped on and glared at her. Plague? Are you crazy? How can there be a plague in this refugee camp? How sure are you? Du Yuanruo, that idiot, didn't know, but Pei Qian knew the ability of the young lady in front of him. Previously, in North Sea City, she had saved the daughter of the richest man. Therefore, since she mentioned that there was a plague, she was definitely not spouting nonsense. 90%. Lin Suisui was very sure. She wasn't in the mood to joke about such a big matter. One person has already died in the camp just now. In order to prevent the plague from spreading, I hope the two of you can quickly come up with a plan. Otherwise, when it spreads, things will probably get even more out of control. As Lin Suisui spoke seriously, Pei Qian quickly reacted. He turned around and instructed Qian He, go, get someone to quickly control the movements of the refugees in the refugee camp. Make sure that no one leaves their tents unless there's valid reason. Get all the officials to put down what they're doing and come see me. Also, get the medical officers on this trip to quickly come and settle things. He didn't have the time to investigate whether this matter was true or not. In short, he would deal with it according to the worst outcome. This way, even if it was a false alarm, he wouldn't lose anything. Hearing that Pei Qian had made a decision without even asking him, Du Yuanruo felt anger. He turned to Pei Qian and shouted unhappily, Pei Qian, are you going to make such a big fuss in the refugee camp just because of a few words from this village girl? Have you ever thought about the consequences if this was just a rumor? At that time, everyone will be in a panic. How are you going to appease them? Qian He, gag this dog and drag him away. In the face of Du Yuanruo's clamor, Pei Qian didn't even look up. He ordered indifferently, and someone came forward and dragged Du Yuanruo away. Du Yuanruo didn't expect Pei Qian to be so ruthless this time. He didn't show any mercy at all. At first, he could still roar and curse in anger, but later on, he was dragged away like a dead dog.